At 0300 hours local time, the night over the Vyazniki farmstead split open. A series of explosions tore through an oil depot on the edge of Mikhaylovsk in Russia's Stavropol Krai, and within minutes the fire reached the fuel tanks. The flames climbed the storage rows one after another. A column of black smoke rose more than 400 feet into the dark, visible for miles across the flat southern Russian steppe. Tens of thousands of gallons of diesel and gasoline were burning on the ground, fuel that was never meant to see a battlefield, yet fuel the front line was waiting for. This depot sat 365 miles from the nearest Ukrainian position. On every Russian map, that distance was supposed to be a shield, hundreds of miles of rear. Air defense concentrated over Moscow, not over a quiet logistics town far behind the war. But what made this strike different was not the fire, it was the calendar. Just days earlier, on the night of July 8th, Ukrainian drones had burned this very site for the first time. Russia had rushed to refill the tanks, to prove the depot still worked, and now, before the smoke of the first attack had fully cleared, Ukraine had come back to finish it. To understand why Ukraine would fly hundreds of miles twice in 1 week for a single fuel depot, you have to understand what this site actually did. The depot outside Mikhaylovsk was not a frontline ammunition dump or a missile base. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more important, a distribution hub. Fuel arrived here mostly by rail, pumped from refineries far to the north, with the nearest major supplier being the Volgograd plant. It was received, stored in rows of tanks, and then sent back out, into tanker trucks, into the network of filling stations feeding southern and central Russia, and toward the units operating along the southern axis of the war. In other words, this was a valve, not the source of the fuel and not the front where it was burned, the point in between where diesel and gasoline were gathered, held, and redistributed. Knock out a valve and everything downstream slows. And the depot's greatest convenience was also its weakness. It sat right beside a railway line, the same steel artery that fed it. That rail line made resupply fast and cheap. It would also become the drone's guide rail in the dark, but we'll come back to that. For years, Moscow treated places like this as untouchable. They were deep in the rear, hundreds of miles from any front, protected less by missiles than by sheer geography. A fuel depot near a sleepy Stavropol town was simply not supposed to be a target a war could reach. That assumption was exactly what Ukraine set out to break. Here is the math that keeps Russian commanders awake at night. A long-range Ukrainian attack drone costs somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars. The air defense systems built to stop it, the layered network of radars, missile batteries, and jammers, cost tens of millions. Every time Russia fires an expensive interceptor at a cheap drone, it loses that exchange even when it wins. And every time a cheap drone gets through, it can erase something worth far more than itself. That is the whole idea. Ukraine is not trying to win this war by matching Russia system for system. It is trying to rewrite the cost of the war itself. The strategy behind the Stavropol strike follows one simple line. You don't need to destroy every tank. You only need to burn the fuel before it reaches the tank. You don't need to silence every gun at the front. You only need to make sure the diesel never arrives to move it. Hit the valve, not the blade. And this depot was only one node in a much larger campaign. In the same stretch of days, Ukrainian drones set fires from Siberia to the Black Sea, a refinery in Omsk, nearly 2,500 miles away, pipeline and refining sites near Ufa, and the Syzran plant deep inside Russia. Ukraine's own general staff claims this long-range campaign has knocked out a large share of Russia's refining capacity and cost the industry billions. Those figures come from Kyiv, and Kyiv has every reason to inflate them, so treat them as a claim, not a confirmed fact. But the claim doesn't have to be exact to matter. The pattern on the ground speaks for itself. Fuel queues, rationing, and rising prices across Russian regions. The depot near Mikhaylovsk was one small cut. The campaign was death by 1,000 cuts. So what actually made the 365-mile reach possible? Ukraine's deep strike campaign runs on long-range, one-way attack drones, most often the fixed-wing An-196 Lyutyy and newer types like the FP-1. No source has confirmed exactly which drone burned the Stavropol depot, so picture the class rather than a serial number. These are not quadcopters. They are long-bodied aircraft with a piston engine and a straight fuel tank, built to fly 1,000 miles or more and put a warhead through a specific point. Their real weapon is not speed, it is independence. They do not need a pilot holding a live video link the whole way. They fly on inertial guidance and a route loaded in before takeoff, correcting themselves in the final phase. Jam their satellite navigation and they keep flying on internal sensors and memory. That is why distance and electronic warfare, the two things Russia counted on, were not enough. Now the shield. Around a rear area fuel depot, Russia does not stack the dense, layered network it puts over Crimea. The workhorse here is the Pantsir S-1, a truck-mounted point defense system with short-range missiles and twin 30mm cannons designed as the goalkeeper that guards logistics hubs, airfields, and depots against exactly this kind of low, slow, small target. Add scattered electronic warfare units trying to break the drone's navigation. On the same night, Russian air defense was firing hard along the Moscow axis, downing dozens of drones near the capital. Whether a battery was actually positioned over this depot, we don't know, but a repeatedly targeted fuel node is precisely the kind of site a Pantsir is meant to cover. And when a warhead finally reaches a tank, the physics are simple and merciless. The charge punches through the steel skin, fuel vapor ignites in a flash, pressure blows the tank open, and the fire spreads to whatever stands beside it. The drones came in low, skimming the flat Stavropol steppe under a black sky. At a few hundred feet, they were almost invisible, too low for long-range radar to separate from the ground clutter, too small and too slow to look like anything worth an interceptor. Their guide was the one feature Russia could not move, the railway line feeding the depot. The same steel that resupplied the tanks now pointed the drones straight at them. This is where the first clock started ticking. From the moment a low-flying drone appears on a screen to the moment a crew confirms it, classifies it, and rotates a launcher, a defender needs at least several seconds. A drone crossing the ground at 110 miles per hour covers about a third of a mile in 10 of those seconds. The system was not slow because it was weak. It was slow because everything was happening too low and too close for the numbers on paper to matter. On paper, the rear was covered. But the battlefield does not run on advertised numbers. As the formation neared the town, the electronic warfare curtain came up. Satellite navigation flickered and dropped, GPS and GLONASS coordinates jumping, then gone. For a drone that depended on them, this was the end of the mission. These did not depend on them. They fell back on inertial guidance and the route burned in before takeoff, holding their heading on internal sensors while the false coordinates screamed nonsense. Where the screen lied, the drones flew on memory. Then the goalkeeper woke up. A Pantsir S-1, if one was covering the depot, as one should have been, swung its radar toward the low approach and fired. Its twin 30mm cannons can throw thousands of rounds a minute, weaving a wall of fire across the final mile. A drone or two dropped out of the sky, but here was the second clock. A point defense system has only so many seconds and so many barrels, and it has to choose which target dies first. Send in more small aircraft than it can service in the time it has, and some will always slip through the gap. They were shot down, but that was a loss already calculated. Then the lead drone's camera caught what the planners had been counting on. The tanks were full again. In the days since the first strike on July 8th, Russia had rushed to refill the depot, to prove the site still worked, that the war's fuel still flowed through Stavropol. Rows that should have been scorched and empty were once more brimming with diesel and gasoline. The most valuable targets in the yard were not the buildings. They were the tanks Russia had just topped off to save face. The priority shifted in seconds. Forget the perimeter, forget the sheds. Go for the fullest tanks in the rows nearest the rail spur, where one rupture could reach the next. Imagine you are the depot's duty officer that night. You spent 3 days reporting that the site was back online. You watched the trains come in and the tanks fill. And now, through the smoke of a fire you thought was behind you, you hear the engines again. And you understand that refilling the depot did not save it. It painted the target. What decides a strike like this? The drone, the jammer, or the fact that the enemy knew exactly when the tanks would be full? Tell me in the comments. The survivors dropped lower still, hugging the rail lines, sliding under the altitude where the cannons could cleanly track them. At that height, a single error meant a power line, a signal mast, the ground itself. But the pilots, or the preloaded route standing in for them, had studied this yard once already. They had burned it before. This time they came back knowing where every full tank stood. The first drones never reached the tanks. They were meant to. Some were caught in the last mile, knocked down by cannon fire or pulled off course by the jamming. On a Russian after-action report, those kills would look like a win. Incoming threats detected, engaged, destroyed. But the report would be measuring the wrong thing. Every interceptor fired, every barrel spun toward the leaders was a second and a shot not spent on the drones behind them. The ones out front were never the point, they were the price. Behind them, the rest came in along the rail line, low and steady, and this time the yard was full. The lead survivor drove into a tank near the spur. The warhead punched through the steel skin and the fuel vapor caught in a flash. A hard orange bloom, then a wall of fire climbing the row. A second drone came through the rising smoke seconds later and found the next tank. That was when the depot stopped being a collection of separate targets and became a single chain. One rupture fed the next. Burning fuel spread along the ground between the tanks, and the heat did the rest, pressure building inside neighboring shells until they failed in turn. The fire did not travel in a straight line so much as jump, tank to tank, row to row, until a large section of the yard was one connected blaze. Thick black smoke rolled over the industrial zone and blotted out the pre-dawn sky. On the ground, the response was exactly what you would expect and exactly what didn't matter anymore. Crews scrambled, emergency vehicles moved in, officials would later report no casualties, and residents on the nearest street were moved to safety, the same evacuation the town had already lived through days earlier. There was no secondary ammunition blast here, no weapons cars cooking off. This was a fuel fire, pure and simple. But a fuel fire in a distribution hub is its own kind of catastrophe. What burns is not just tonight's diesel, but the depot's ability to move any fuel at all for as long as it takes to rebuild. By the time the sky lightened, the tanks Russia had rushed to refill were burning back down to nothing. There is a difference between destruction and paralysis, and this strike was about the second one. Destruction is what you saw. Tanks burned, fuel gone, a yard turned to smoke. Real, but replaceable. Russia can rebuild tanks and refill them. It had already proven that in the days between the two attacks. If burning one depot were the whole goal, Russia could shrug it off. Paralysis is the deeper wound. Hit a rear area fuel valve twice in 1 week, 365 miles from the front, and you force Moscow to make choices it hates. Do you pull air defense systems back from the front line to cover fuel depots that were never supposed to need covering? Every Pantsir moved to guard a tank farm in Stavropol is one no longer shielding troops at the front. Do you slow the trains, reroute the fuel, add security to 100 quiet sites that used to protect themselves with distance alone? Each of those choices costs time, money, and attention, and none of them puts fuel any faster into the vehicles that actually need it. And this was one node. Across the same week, the same pattern burned from Omsk to the Black Sea. The result on the ground was not a single spectacular collapse, but a slow tightening, fuel queues, rationing, prices climbing across Russian regions, not one knockout blow, 1,000 cuts, and this depot was one of them. The message from that burning yard near Mikhaylovsk is simple. There is no depth deep enough anymore. A town hundreds of miles from any front, a quiet valve in the fuel network was hit, refilled, and hit again because Ukraine decided that Russia's rear would no longer be a safe place to store a war. So here's the question worth arguing over. Is Russia's real weakness its front line or the fragile fuel network keeping that front line alive? Tell me what you think below. If this breakdown was worth your time, hit like, subscribe, and share it so more people understand how this war is actually being fought. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.